Deep into History is part of the Big Heads Media Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more podcasts. Welcome to Deep into History. I'm your host, Arjun Hundal. Consider this a foreword. Today's tale is perhaps one of the best known in history. It comes to us from an oral tradition handed down for centuries from one poet, bard, or lore master to the next. It also comes to us out of what many believe to be the first dark age of mankind. For after the events described in our tale to be, within a few short decades, most of the civilizations of the Bronze Age were destroyed, ruined, and in many cases would have been utterly lost to us if not for the work of many brilliant archaeologists and historians over the last century or so. So in an effort to give you the most realistic version of the events, acting in my capacity as your lore master, I draw from a series of poems and stories called the Epic Cycle, and match them with the latest historical and archaeological research on the subject. I will attempt to stay as true to the original story when describing characters and circumstances, while utilizing the best current thoughts on the actual capabilities of the civilizations in question. Keep that in mind as we go forward, and with that said, this foreword comes to an end. Before we start, I make no secret that I write my scripts while listening to incredible music. My Patreon supporter Jessica asked if I would say what songs inspire my writing each episode, an informal soundtrack if you will. Since I pretty much do anything my patrons want, hey Jessica, this is for you. A wise guy once said you get 3 great loves in your life. I've had 2. Ironically, on both occasions, our eyes met across our high school library. Because of personal entanglements, I'll say no more. But when I think back on those perfect moments, Set Adrift on Memory Bliss by PM Dawn plays in my mind. Thus it's the only song I could ever use to describe the meeting of Helen in Paris. And though I can't give you more details about my first loves, I can tell you how those perfect moments so many years ago make me feel. I'll spare you my singing, but just say, baby you set me, set adrift on memory bliss of you. All actions of Achilles and the Myrmidons were written exclusively to y'all been worn by the Wu-Tang Clan. I don't make this statement lightly. The next time you hear that oh-so-epic song and you truly hear the lyrics and experience the beat, this episode will resonate in your mind. I'll end this segment by throwing up a W in the air and say, Wu-Tang, Wu-Tang, Wu-Tang. Season 2, let's go. It is the pinnacle of the Bronze Age, the Age of Heroes, a time when mankind has reached a level of civilization never known before. The first time when agriculture and the domestication of animals in the Near East has reached a level where large populations could survive and indeed thrive. From the Aegean Sea down into the southern Mediterranean and many, many miles inland, hundreds of large towns and a few small cities have risen and flourished through trade and the manufacturing of goods, planned and specialized economies that are intricately linked by trade networks. These small cities do homage to or are directly controlled by 3 major powers. In the south, rich and mighty Egypt, an agricultural powerhouse, whose soil is perennially replenished by the flooding of the Nile River, has allowed a very advanced and sophisticated society to evolve. Inland to the east, in the depths of modern Turkey and parts of northern Mesopotamia, the Hittites rule supreme, a harsh warrior society that has come to thrive due to its near monopoly on tin, that when combined with copper created the metal alloy bronze, on which every society of this era depends. Egypt and the Hittites are proto-empires, each with hundreds of towns and vast lands under their direct control. They are perennial enemies and the superpowers of the Bronze Age. Entering later in the period, but rising quickly to a dominant position in the Aegean Sea, come the Greeks. At first raiders and plunderers striking out from the relatively secure Greek mainland to sack and burn the cities on the Aegean islands, they have now settled most of those same islands. A heroic culture obsessed with honoring their gods, their greatest heroes, and conquest. And in the middle of these 3 great powers was a land about 4/5 the size of England that had dozens of towns, great and small. Over the centuries, many different cities had been dominant in the region. As we approach the year 1184 before the Common Era, Troy has gained hegemony over them all. Though nominal vassals to the Hittites, Troy was the supreme power in that land and a true crossroads of the ancient world. Its location being the only natural harbor at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the Hellespont, has allowed it to grow immensely wealthy by taxing all trade moving in and out of the Black Sea and beyond. Troy was famous for its horses, which thrived on the vast plains of Anatolia. Troy's vast wealth is the envy of the Aegean world and has gained the most unwelcome attention of the ever-greedy and opportunistic Agamemnon, scion of the house of Atreus, king of Mycenae and high king of the Greeks. He commands vast hosts of hardened and brutal warriors, and even now is watching and waiting for the best possible moment to strike, and that moment may have just arrived, For in the east, the Hittite Empire is in the midst of a catastrophic dynastic civil war, leaving the vassal cities on the modern coast of Turkey on their own, and thus making them a very tempting target. In an effort to ensure peace and stability, King Priam of Troy sends his son Paris as an envoy to Sparta to treat with King Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother. Offering lavish gifts, King Priam hopes to avoid war by winning over the Greeks with extremely generous trade agreements. His reasoning was sound because when combined with the armies of his allied cities, Troy nearly equaled the strength of Greece. Why risk war when riches could be shared through trade? However, wise old Priam had not considered matters of the heart. For you see, Sparta was the home of Helen, queen and wife of King Menelaus, and rumored to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And when Paris saw Helen, all thought of his duty, his city, his family, and the welfare of his people simply faded away, replaced by one emotion more powerful than all others combined: lust. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, put some smoke in the air if you choose, and prepare to become one with Paris, Prince of Troy, in the palace at Sparta, during his desperate mission for peace. Ready? Then let's go. You force yourself to relive a dream you had had mere weeks before, for if you allowed yourself to experience your emotions in public, Menelaus would take offense, and the Spartans would kill the entire embassy of your father, King Priam of glorious Troy, King of Kings of Anatolia, who only answered to the Hittite throne. You stare straight ahead because you dare not look at her again. You are seated between King Menelaus and the newly arrived Queen Helen of Sparta. Before you is the large hall of kings, the Megaron, in the palace of Amyclae in Sparta. There is festive music being played, but you can't hear it. The hall is filled with Spartans and Trojans feasting, drinking, and laughing. There are dozens of scantily clad beauties dancing for everyone's entertainment, but you can't see them. You have retreated into your mind's eye, and you are reliving that half-forgotten dream. In it, you awaken beside a small pond in a beautiful glade, surrounded by lush trees and bushes of flowers. The grass you are laying on is as soft as the finest Egyptian cotton. In the distance you can see the snow-capped peak of Mount Ida, so very near to Troy. Forcing yourself up from the impossibly warm and soft embrace of the grass, as if compelled, you stand and turn to find 3 beautiful women standing before you. As you begin to truly take them in, you can't help but gasp as you realize that they are all the very essence of perfection. As a prince, blessed by the gods with charm, wit, and incredible looks, you have seduced hundreds of beautiful maidens, yet all their beauty combined stands as nothing next to these 3 perfect beings. They introduce themselves as Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera, goddesses. You kneel and lower your eyes in reverence. On the ground before you inexplicably is a shimmering golden apple. Before you can even think about it, Hera begins to speak, and your gaze is pulled directly into hers. She explains that Zeus would not award the golden apple to any of them for fear of causing a rift amongst the gods, thus causing a war in Olympus. By the decree of the gods, your life of constant womanizing, with an exceptional eye for beauty, has made you the only mortal judge worthy of beholding the beauty of a goddess. So you had been chosen to judge them and award the golden apple of discord to the fairest of all. Instead of being stunned at the magnitude of the request, the arrogant, selfish, and conniving side of you forces you to ask them to disrobe, so that you may behold these perfect beings naked. As soon as you speak the words, however, you are filled with dread at the thought that you had just given them a mortal insult. Yet they are not offended. One by one they disrobe before you, and as they do, you hear each goddess's voice in your mind. They are each trying to bribe you. Hera says if you choose her as the fairest, she will make you king of Europe and Asia, and you see yourself sitting on your father's throne in command of vast armies and unlimited riches. Athena offers you limitless wisdom and skill in war. You see yourself the first up the walls of some distant battlement, vanquishing foes left and right with sword and shield. How embarrassing it would be for Hector if his little brother suddenly became the wisest and most skilled warrior in the world. You allow yourself a quick smile at the thought. As Aphrodite's voice begins to resonate in your mind, you hear beautiful music, and flowers spring up all around you. She offers you the hand in marriage of the most beautiful woman in the world. Your mind is filled with visions of incredible beauty, beyond anything you've ever seen. It is almost with wrenching pain that the visions are withdrawn, and all you want to experience is that formless beauty again. You are addicted to it. Without hesitation, you pick up the golden apple and give it to Aphrodite. The dream fades away, and you are snapped back to reality. You had thought it just a dream, yet the woman sitting beside you is the vision of beauty you had beheld made human. You only dared to look at her for a few moments as she entered the hall accompanied by her handmaidens. She only wore a simple though costly gown of white oiled linen which shimmered as she moved, accentuating her flawless figure. She only wore a simple gold necklace and earrings, for it is apparent to all she needs no ornaments. Her long blonde hair is curled and oiled and shines like the sun in the barest flicker of torchlight, and her eyes, you dare not look into them again for fear of losing your soul in their depths. She is flawless, she is perfect, she is a mortal goddess. She is Helen of Sparta. You have never seen anything or anyone like her. Even the goddesses in your dream seem hopelessly drab in comparison. To your right, King Menelaus, her husband, is boisterously laughing and crudely fondling a dancer he had just pulled onto his lap. Anger rises within you. How dare he insult Helen with this vulgar display in public? Your hand drops to the dagger at your belt, and you suddenly find yourself contemplating opening his throat. For you are Paris, Prince of Troy, brother of Hector, and though men scoff at your prowess with spear and sword, you are among the most lethal archers in the world, and Ares himself with your dagger. Your grip tightens on its hilt when you hear her voice, sweet as a note played by a master flautist, yet so much more rich and confident. Prince Paris, tell me of your city, tell me of Troy. Her soft melodic voice calms you, and you turn to face her. You freeze. For the first time in your life you are speechless. She smiles at you, and your stomach flutters and your cheeks flush in embarrassment. She maintains her smile for a fleeting moment, and goes on to tell you all she knows of Troy. How it's the trade center of the world, how she longed to visit the great trading market outside the city walls. She speaks at length about her admiration for the freedom of the women of Troy. She then enthralls you with an expert analysis of the current Hittite dynastic civil war. You know every faction she spoke about from the endless strategy sessions you had been forced to attend in your father's Megaron. Yet here, in faraway Sparta, Helen saw the probable outcome of the war far more astutely than your father's wisest counselors. Still unable to speak, all you can do is nod. She then goes on at length about the tales she has heard about the beauty of Troy, surrounded by vast plains with thousands of grazing horses. How the women were allowed to speak their minds and walk freely in the streets, and how she wished she had such freedom. As she continues to speak, you look into her angelic brown eyes and allow yourself to become lost in them, and your mind drifts. With Helen at your side, you see your father, King Priam, welcome you both to Troy, and the city bathing in the light of your love. A thought from somewhere darker in your subconscious appears in your mind, and you see your father setting aside Hector and declaring you his heir. And you decide, Helen is your destiny, and you will do anything you can to seduce her. She asks about Andromache, your brother Hector's wife, but before you can form a response, you hear carnal grunts and squeals. Menelaus is having his way with a dancer on his lap before the entire court. You look back to Helen, and you see a flush of embarrassment creep into her cheeks and the barest instant of hurt in her eyes, quickly replaced by fury. You must excuse me, Paris. She stands and strides from the Megaron, her handmaidens in swift pursuit, a goddess followed by nymphs. You are left reeling from the enormity of what you have decided to do. You would take Helen away from her brutish husband and make her fall in love with you and take her as your wife. The mission your father had entrusted to you be damned. If the Spartans came to Troy, you would fight beside Hector and the Trojan army and crush them. That night you can barely sleep. You are consumed by thoughts of Helen. The next day passes with slow agony as you count the seconds to the night's feast at which you will be able to speak to her again. Yet after the long day passes and you are once again in the crowded Megaron, there is no sign of her. You are again seated next to the drunk Menelaus, forcing yourself to smile at his crude jokes. A horn is blown at the far end of the hall, and a road-weary messenger enters the hall and the room quiets. The messenger approaches and delivers his message quietly to Menelaus. You aren't listening, as all you can think of is seeing Helen again. When the messenger departs, Menelaus turns to you. He informs you that he must depart Sparta immediately on an urgent errand, but will only be gone for a few days. He insists that you stay and enjoy the hospitality of Sparta, and that when he returns, you will celebrate the peace treaty between your people that he meant to formalize upon his return. He offers you his hand, and you shake it. At the far end of the hall, just past the ornate entrance, you see one of Helen's handmaidens crossing. She looks at you and winks. For a brief moment, you brush off the gesture as nothing more than one of the hundreds you have received from other women. Then realization hits you like a bolt of Zeus's lightning. The sudden message, the need for Menelaus to depart, the perfect opportunity. Could Helen have planned all of this? Of course she did. And with that you know you never had a chance at seducing Helen, for it was she that had seduced you. You had met your match, and Aphrodite had fulfilled her promise. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would be yours. You look straight into Menelaus's pig-like eyes and smile. Let the smoky Megaron filled with Spartans and Trojans fade away. Allow the selfish lust of the two would-be lovers to pass. Come back to deep into history and hear me say, This is the tale of a world torn apart by war, the tale of two cultures locked in a desperate battle for survival. For one side, losing meant utter destruction. For the other, losing would mean rebellion and challenges at home. A saga of greed, brutality, honor, hardship, loss, and above all, love. The last saga of the Age of Heroes, and I assure you, my dear friend, the Age of Heroes saved its best for its last act. The epic tale that saw the rise and fall of the greatest warrior of them all, and how this war became the most famous story in history. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let your mind flow to my voice as we go deep into the 12th century before the Common Era and experience the Trojan War. Peerless. Welcome. When Menelaus returned to Sparta, he found that his wife had been kidnapped, for that is how he chose to see it. He raged. As if this wasn't bad enough, he was also informed that most of the Spartan treasury was stolen as well, for Helen wouldn't leave without a proper dowry. Menelaus again saw this as confirmation that the wily Trojans had indeed kidnapped her and raided the treasury before making good their escape. He mounted his chariot and rode north to Mycenae, the seat of his brother Agamemnon, High King of the Greeks. Upon his arrival, he dismounted and made the climb up to the mighty fortress perched on a hilltop in a powerful defensive position. He strode under the Lion's Gate and into the citadel, where he was immediately received by his brother. Agamemnon consoled Menelaus and promised to aid him in recovering Helen, though he was secretly overjoyed at the news. He had long desired war with the Trojans and to claim all the wealth of the East for himself. As night fell, runners were dispatched with messages to all the kings of Greece, ordering them to prepare for war. Normally the Greeks would never work together in such large numbers. Though nominally a proto-nation with a semblance of unity, there were a few kings nearly as powerful as Agamemnon, and many more cities with bitter rivalries, feuds, and even hatreds. Yet in the end, they all answered his call to arms. To make sense of this, I'm going to give you a classic deep into history historical nutshell. The previous decades had seen the rise of Mycenae as the mightiest of the Greek cities in the Peloponnese, the southeastern half, separated from the rest of Greece by the narrow isthmus of Corinth. Due to their unrelenting expansionism and military might, all of the many cities of the Peloponnese submitted to Agamemnon as their overlord, and he was named King of Kings. Elsewhere in Greece were other powers, kings who had lesser kings sworn to them. These were called high kings, such as King Peleus of Thessaly, Achilles' father. These high kings had their own powerful armies and ruled as they saw fit. A few did homage to Agamemnon as King of Kings to keep the peace on the mainland, but it was a loose affiliation at best. Now in Sparta, directly south and very close to Mycenae, the elderly king Tyndareus, Helen's father, had a serious problem. Sparta was rich and powerful, but its might was dwarfed by its neighbor to the north, Mycenae. He had 2 daughters and 2 very young sons. In order to secure his kingdom, he married his eldest daughter Clytemnestra to Agamemnon. Yet alas, this did nothing to assuage his fears for the fate of his people once he died. His sons were far too young to inherit the throne, and the ever-greedy Agamemnon would surely see Sparta as easy prey upon his death. So he made a fateful decision. He sent word to all the eligible suitors of Greece and the islands beyond. The man who married Helen would become king of Sparta upon his death, thus setting aside his young sons. Tales of the beauty of Helen, even as a young girl, had gone far and wide. When coupled with her dowry being the throne of Sparta, suitors from all over Greece came. 45 kings and princes arrived in Sparta, bringing gifts and all vying for the hand of Helen. The atmosphere was becoming contentious, and Tyndareus feared that whoever he chose would insult the rest, and the result would be a bloodbath in the Megaron. Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, came up with a cunning plan. In exchange for the hand of the king's niece Penelope, he had Tyndareus make all the suitors swear a holy vow to the gods in Olympus that they would defend the chosen husband against whoever should quarrel against him, and avenge any wrong committed against his marriage to Helen. Many kings were wary of the tricks of Odysseus, so even though he had withdrawn himself as a suitor, he was forced to take the vow himself. After this vow was sworn, a prize stallion was sacrificed in the throne room, and each suitor marked himself with its blood. It was a true blood oath that could never be broken. After this terrible vow, Tyndareus chose Menelaus to be Helen's husband and the next king of Sparta. Thus, when the tale of Helen's departure with Paris was spun in Greece as a kidnapping and raid under the guise of a mission of peace, most of the major kings of Greece were honor-bound to answer Agamemnon's call to war. Odysseus, on his island of Ithaca, feigned mental illness when Agamemnon's messenger arrived, a minor prince named Palamedes. Palamedes did not believe that Odysseus was sick or had lost his wit, so he rudely pulled Odysseus's infant son from his mother's arms and placed him before an oxen that was pulling a plow in the field where Odysseus was wallowing in the soil, part of his act. When he saw that his son was about to be trampled, he leapt up and ran to save the infant. With his ruse exposed, Odysseus had no choice but to gather his men and honor his oath. He privately swore that he would have vengeance against Palamedes for daring to touch his son. Remember this incident, for it will have major implications later in our tale. Elsewhere, those who swore the oath came, and the prospects of rich plunder and glory brought most of the rest of the kings of Greece onto Agamemnon's side. The exception to this was King Peerless and his son Achilles in the north, who had sworn no oaths and seemed quite content to sit out the war. The army and fleet began to mass at Aulis on the central eastern coast of Greece. A quick word about the structure of Greek society in this era. The mainland and the island states of the Aegean were not true cities or states as we would think of them today. They are more accurately described as large estates, fortified manors, and in some cases citadels, usually built on an advantageous defensive position such as a high hill or a protective cove on the coast. Many would be surrounded by planted fields, which were serviced by the peasantry who lived in villages. In these fortified citadels, like Agamemnon's in Mycenae, 3/4 of the space would be used for workshops, blacksmiths, and food storage. Semi-annual tributes would pour in from the countryside and vassal manors. These raw materials would then be processed into trade goods such as clay pots, linen fabric, and wine. Of course, most of the metal mined was used for weapons and armor. The kings of these citadels, as well as the nobles from smaller manors, would have household warriors who were solely devoted to training for war and raiding. This was a classical heroic culture, where the lords would ride chariots into battle to deliver them to the front lines to fight for and rally around their troops. Chariots of this period were primarily used as quick battlefield transport, though some sources claimed that they would also be used to engage enemy chariots directly. The Greek armies at the end of the Bronze Age had also evolved beyond deploying relatively few expensively equipped bronze-armored heavy infantry into larger, more complex forces. They contained light, quick infantry, armored in leather, and archers used to support the heavy infantry. In this age, the spear was the primary weapon on the battlefield, between 4 to 6 feet in length with laser-sharp bronze tips, which were used both for throwing and thrusting at the enemy. The sword was a secondary weapon, in most cases a weapon of last resort, because bronze is brittle, and if struck repeatedly it would shatter or break. Though this is indeed the Bronze Age, it's possible that some kings or heroes had swords made of iron, though this would have been prohibitively expensive, and iron was extremely rare. There are examples of iron arrowheads found near the site of Troy and inland in the Hittite territory dating to this era. I've found that the best way to think of the kings and heroes of these types of armies as force multipliers, similar to artillery on a modern battlefield. Delivered by fast chariots at the right moment to the right location, they had the potential to turn the tides of any battle. The exact battle formations in which they fought are unknown. Everything from disorganized charging hordes of warriors to a simple straight battle line to a kind of proto-phalanx have been suggested. The Greeks were first and foremost sea raiders, and their armies were built for raiding and conquering the islands of the Aegean. Their ships were primarily pentaconters, 50-oared vessels, 25 per side, and with a single sail. The soldiers would man the oars and serve as marines in naval combat. These ships did not have rams like the later Greek ships. Instead, they would rush the beaches of the islands of the Aegean, pushing onto the shore as much as half of their length. Then the heavy infantry would jump from the heavy and thick wood in front of the ship to engage the enemy. They would receive covering fire from archers shooting from the height of the deck and would quickly be followed by their light infantry. In heavy engagements, smaller ships carrying chariots and their horses would beach, unload, quickly assemble the team, and hero and driver would mount and rush into battle. An entire book of the Iliad is devoted to a roll call of the kings and their ships. I won't subject you to that very long list, but I think it would be helpful for us to go over some of the major figures that will feature prominently in our tale. The Greek kings and heroes. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, leader of the Greeks, king of kings. Menelaus, king of Sparta, Helen's husband, a brute, brother of Agamemnon. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the most cunning of the Greeks, also a notorious pirate known as the sacker of cities. Old Nestor, king of Pylos, wise counselor, who ascended the throne after Hercules murdered his entire family. Mighty Ajax, prince of Salamis, the bulwark of the Greeks, always the largest man on any battlefield. Diomedes, king of Argos, whose war cry could be heard miles away, Second in skill in warfare only to Achilles, Prince of Phthia, leader of the Myrmidons. In Troy, society was set up in much the same way, except Troy was what we would consider a true kingdom. All answered to King Priam. His word was law. He was loved by his people, for he had led the armies of Troy in countless battles. He was a skilled warrior and general, and led his city to glory. Under his rule, Troy had become the preeminent power on the fringes of the Hittite Empire. All the cities of the region did Troy homage, paid annual tributes, and answered his call to war. Now old, he was still wise and ruled his people justly. He had sired 50 sons and even more daughters with his wife and his dozens of concubines. He liked to brag that he could field an entire army with just the fruits of his loins. He was a skillful negotiator and was only subject to the Hittite throne, though at this time the Hittites were tearing themselves apart in a catastrophic civil war for the throne. Thus it was that King Priam sent Paris on his mission of peace to Sparta. As it turned out, his worst mistake. Troy itself was large, what we would consider a small city. The latest archaeological digs from the site near the entrance to the Dardanelles, also called the Hellespont, show a city of 70 square acres, surrounded by strong walls 17 feet high and 20 feet thick. The famous walls of Troy also had towers and turrets for defense. Within was a flourishing city stacked with houses 3 stories high and organized streets leading up to a citadel on the high hill, again surrounded by powerful walls. A fortress within a heavily fortified city. In terms of population, modern estimates put Priam's Troy at approximately 10,000 citizens. This number could rise drastically after harvest and in peak trading season, when the sheltered lagoon a kilometer away was filled with trading ships. This lagoon, now dry land, was one of the main sources of Trojan wealth. They would tax all ships that put in for shelter at the harbor. During trading season, late spring to early fall, thousands of ships would be forced to stop there for fresh water, shelter from storms, and to sell their wares. This made Troy a true crossroad of the world. In addition, Troy was famous for breeding horses, which thrived on the vast plains of Anatolia. They were wily traders. To give you an idea of how the Trojans were viewed as horse traders by the Greeks and others, consider how people today think of used car dealers. Troy was rich, powerful, refined, and truly a center of culture and opportunity that made the citadels of Greece look positively provincial. Troy was also peculiar in another way. Its geography gave it control of shipping between the Black Sea and the Aegean, thus making it a naval power. Yet beyond a few harbor patrol vessels and a few ships for long voyages, Troy was a sea power without a navy. Instead, for offensive operations, Troy could field vast numbers of chariots due to their near monopoly on the best horses of the age. They had an elite force of spearmen and a vast contingent of archers. Trojan archers were among the best in the world, equipped with Scythian-style bows. They were early experts at deploying massed arrow fire to devastating effect. For defense, Troy had its massive walls and battlements, which would be manned by those same archers. In addition, Troy was surrounded by a 4-meter deep and 3-meter wide trench that would make it extremely difficult for any enemy attempting to scale the walls. Let me give you a quick rundown of some of the major players on the Trojan side. Priam, king of Troy, overlord of western Anatolia. Prince Hector, heir to the throne, hero, the commander of Troy's army, a feared warrior, and an excellent spearman. Prince Paris, lover more than fighter, a spoiled and self-centered man, a skilled archer. Aeneas, prince of Dardania, Hector's cousin and right hand, Troy's staunchest ally, a hero. When Paris and Helen fled Sparta on Paris's ships laden with all the gold and jewels of the treasury, they stopped on the island of Cranae to consummate their relationship. After that short honeymoon, they made straight for Troy, wishing to reach the safety of its walls. When they arrived, they received a mixed welcome. Most of the nobles of the city were shocked that Paris had stolen Menelaus' wife and Sparta's treasury. Many knew this would mean war. However, in Troy, only one opinion mattered. King Priam welcomed the couple and embraced Helen as a daughter. Priam annulled Helen's marriage to Menelaus in a semi-religious ceremony, as according to Hittite law, a woman had the right to divorce her husband. He saw to it that they had a royal wedding in the citadel. It seems likely that the Trojans had no idea of the terrible oath that so many Greek kings had sworn to uphold the rights of Helen's husband. It also seems likely that Helen didn't tell them. By offending Sparta, Paris had offended most of the kings of Greece, and Troy was about to feel the full wrath of the entire Greek world. In Greece, at the sheltered inlet of Aulis, Agamemnon's forces were now gathering. Perhaps because of a prophecy, a vision, or just common sense, it was clear that his army would require the services of the finest fighting force in all of Greece. Thus he dispatched Odysseus to the north to acquire the services of Achilles and the Myrmidons. Hailing from northern Greece, King Peerless, Achilles' father, had had no part in the oath of the suitors for Helen's hand. The region that he controlled was constantly under threat from barbarian raiders. As such, the Myrmidons were a full-time professional army, an elite strike force that could quickly track down and destroy raiding bands of warriors over land, or sail their ships up the coast to intercept them quickly. This was achieved through constant training, superior armor and weapons, and excellent strategy. Though no source confirms this, it is highly suggested that they were the only force that was fully equipped at ruinous expense with full sets of bronze armor. This would give them a huge advantage in battle against even the relatively equipped forces they faced from their rivals in Greece. Odysseus secured their support, and with them sailed back to the staging point at Aulis. When they arrived, they would have seen a sight that no one had seen before. The combined massed armies and navies of the Greek people united under the lion banner of Agamemnon. Ancient sources claim that this force contained over 1,000 ships and 100,000 troops. These numbers are completely implausible given the resources available to Bronze Age Greece. Modern estimates based on the population and agricultural studies put the number at 15,000 troops and 300 ships, and a small fleet of supply ships that carried supplies, horses, and chariots. Once ashore, Achilles, at Agamemnon's insistence, was forced to swear an oath that he would see the invasion through. Aside from the massive egos involved, Agamemnon had a huge problem. The Greeks were eager to sail, yet the north wind Boreas would not cease blowing, and until it relented, the Greeks would be trapped on the beach. This went on for weeks. Already there were rumors that some of the kings who had not sworn the terrible oath to uphold Menelaus' rights as Helen's husband were considering abandoning the army. Now the Greeks of this age were religious to a fanatical degree. The unceasing blowing of the north wind could only mean the gods were displeased with them, or at least one of their leaders. Agamemnon called upon his chief priest, seer, and interpreter of the will of the gods of Olympus, Calchas. The importance of men like this cannot be overstated. They were the Greeks' conduit to their gods, especially in the Bronze Age, when Greek religion lacked the structure and formality it would develop in the later classical period. A seer that had the trust, confidence, and loyalty of a king was immensely powerful, and their words held tremendous sway. Calchas performed his rituals and informed the gathered Greek kings that the goddess Artemis was wroth with Agamemnon because he had hunted and killed one of her children, a deer in a sacred glade. In order to regain the goddess's favor and stop the ill will, she demanded an eye for an eye, a child for a child. She demanded that Agamemnon's eldest daughter be offered as a human sacrifice in a religious ceremony dedicated to her on an altar at Aulis. What happens next should tell us all we need to know about the character and relentless ambition of Agamemnon. Seemingly without hesitation, he sends a message to his citadel at Mycenae with an alluring lie to fool his wife and daughter. He informs them that in order to bolster his alliance, he has arranged for Iphigenia to marry Achilles and that her presence was required immediately. Having no reason to doubt this, she is dispatched to Aulis by her mother, dressed in her wedding finery. When she arrives, she is led to what she assumed to be her wedding altar, but instead of Achilles, she is met by Calchas, who brutally slits her throat and spills her blood on the altar. When Achilles learned that his name had been used in the vile trick, he was enraged, even considering killing the king before being talked down by this act by Phoenix, his old friend, teacher, and general of the Myrmidons. If Achilles attacked Agamemnon, the result would be civil war right there on the beach. Instead, he raged throughout the night. This breach between the two men would never be repaired. It was only his sacred oath upon landing that kept the Myrmidons from departing, and the animosity between the two men would only grow and fester to the detriment of all. Miraculously, the next morning the weather cleared and the black pentaconters of the Greek armada set sail. In fact, they had perfect weather for the entire voyage to Troy. Modern estimates put the length of their voyage at between 1 to 2 weeks. We know that the Trojans were forewarned of their approach, most likely from their allies on the islands of the Aegean Sea, because they had fortified the beach with stakes, anti-chariot trenches, and lined the shore with their massed army and the forces of their geographically closest allies. Hector would have directed this operation, and their goal seems clear: to deny the Greeks a beachhead and cause enough casualties to perhaps repulse the invasion once and for all. These preparations would have been frantic and thorough. Behind every barricade and obstacle would have been lines of entrenched Trojan archers, protected by squads of Dardanian spearmen led by Aeneas. They would have been careful to leave channels open through their fortifications for them to deploy their prodigious number of chariots. The Greek landing and storming of the beach at Troy is very much akin to a Bronze Age version of the Allied landings in France during World War II. Well before the Greeks were in sight, the Trojans and their allies would have heard the rhythmic boom, boom, boom of drums on the ships beating out the time to their rowers. In response, the heroes present on the shore, such as Hector and Aeneas, would have given rousing speeches to rally their men's spirits, and their war cry in answer would have thundered across the water. When the black ships of the Greeks entered the Dardanelles and turned to enter the sheltered bay, they would have seen the fortified beach, manned by thousands of troops, and the golden city in the near distance beyond. As we discussed, the Greeks numbered 15,000, and modern sources put the entire Trojan alliance at almost exactly the same number, a seemingly even match. However, Troy's strength was spread across the allied cities of Anatolia and in Thrace to the north. At the time of the assault, given that they had little time to gather their strength, there would have been no more than 3,000 to 4,000 men manning the defenses. Given the inherent advantages of defending a fortified position and the fact that the Trojans knew the land on which they fought, the task of securing the beach would be titanic. Instead of slowing at the sight, the Greeks began to row harder. They needed to reach maximum speed so their ships would push deep onto the shoreline, so that their rowing troops could quickly arm and jump from their ships to begin the storm. The first contingent of the armada to reach the shore were the 40 ships of the men of Phylace and Thessaly, led by their king Prothesilaus, who had been a suitor of Helen and sworn the terrible oath. Armored in bronze and wielding a spear, Prothesilaus jumped from the prow of his ship, quickly followed by his more lightly armored men. This first force would have been showered by a rain of Trojan arrows. Prothesilaus himself was the first Greek to die at Troy. Rushing ahead of his men, he slew 4 archers before he was rushed by Hector, who effortlessly dispatched him with the thrust of his spear. Ever more black ships would have been rocketing towards the beach, their rowers urged on at the sight of their fellow Greeks being slaughtered. The ships of Odysseus and his Ithacans came next, followed immediately by those of Ajax. The Greeks were fighting to gain a foothold, but the Trojans fought brilliantly. It seemed that the defense would hold, and the invasion would be repulsed with heavy losses. Until Achilles and the Myrmidons arrived, that is. Now I could just tell you what happened during the most titanic amphibious operation in the Bronze Age, a feat that mankind would not repeat for centuries. But this is deep into history, and you're with your friend and Lore Master Arjun. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly. Trust me, if you got it, put some smoke in the air, and prepare to become one with Phoenix, general of the Myrmidons, and witness Achilles' fury unleashed. The events at the heavily defended and fortified beach of Troy in the early spring of 1184 BCE might have gone something like this. Ready? Then let's go. You were standing on the deck of the Chiron, flagship of the Myrmidons, holding a flank of the line of 20 ships of your contingent of the colossal armada, lined up to storm the beach. On either side of you sit 25 warriors pulling oars, at a pace dictated by the drum beating loudly next to the rudder on the rear of the ship. They were your men, who you knew, who you trained with, fought with, bled with, and loved like sons. For you were Phoenix, general of the greatest fighting force in the world, the man who had trained Prince Achilles. The thought of Achilles brings your eyes forward to the prow of the ship, and there standing in his bronze armor, glistening in the sea spray and sunlight, he stands, his back to you, scanning the fast-approaching battlefield. He wears his plumed helmet, robbing you the sight of the expression on his face. He turns his head, planning his attack. Achilles had spoken barely a word to you or the men since you departed Aulis so many days ago. Outwardly, the rage he had experienced on the beach when he learned Agamemnon had used his name to lure his own daughter to her death had cooled. But you knew him better than that. You had a hand in raising him. As a boy, his father, King Peleus, was cold and distant, and his mother, Thetis, a strange woman who would torment the child with strange prophecies and visions she claimed she had seen about him. An only child, a lonely child, he had been a quiet boy. The only times you had seen him come to life were when his cousins Ajax and Teucer would come to visit from faraway Salamis. The boys were of an age and eventually became his closest brothers. Still, their stays were brief, and young Achilles would return to his lonely existence. At age 8, his father had charged you, a warrior in your prime at the time, to train him and instruct him in the martial arts. At first he was shy and reluctant, yet as time passed you had won his trust, and you had formed a friendship with the prince. He was an intelligent student, and at the time you judged that he would grow to become a fine Myrmidon. In the spring of his 9th year, the boy had gone hiking on nearby Mount Pelion and vanished for weeks. The Myrmidons had been dispatched to scour the mountainside, and after 10 days you were forced to inform his father that there was no sign of him, and you feared he was dead. His mother was unconcerned and told you that he would return unharmed, for she had seen it in a vision. When the boy finally reappeared at the gates of his father's city, he was fine, not a scratch on him, in clean clothes, and looked recently washed. He informed the royal court that he had met a being named Chiron, the last centaur, in a glade on the mountain. He said that Chiron befriended him, trained with him, and spoke to him about the gods. He would nearly scoffed as he told the tale, and his father looked so close to rage that he looked like he might hit him. But his mother approached the boy and looked into his eyes for a very long minute. She then declared that he was telling the truth and promised that he would not be punished. The next day in the training yard, you had to admit his skills had improved immensely. He was faster, stronger, and his forms with spear and sword nearly equaled yours. You had never known him to be anything but honest, so you decided to take him at his word, yet a doubt remained in your mind. Over the coming years, Achilles would disappear for days at a time into the forest on Mount Pelion, and each time he returned, his skills improved far beyond what you were capable of imparting to him. Then when he was 11, he returned from his wanderings with a sword unlike any you had seen before, newly forged, and of a metal that you had seen, but never in such quantity. Iron, a priceless weapon. He said that Chiron had taught him all he could, and had given him the sword as a parting gift. After that, you never doubted his tale or his word again. At age 12, at his father's insistence, he had accompanied the Myrmidons on an attack on a barbarian encampment just beyond the border. The attack had quickly devolved into a disorganized melee due to the sheer number of the enemy tribe. In the chaos, you had become separated from your charge. Desperate to find him, you cut through many warriors, only to see Achilles locked in a duel with the barbarian chieftain. You sprinted towards him, yet when you got close, you slowed because what you saw utterly shocked you. The still growing and immature boy was dodging and expertly cutting at the huge brute. His strength had not developed much past boyhood, so instead of parrying, he used his speed and agility to run circles around his opponent. Each swing meant flesh. Each dodge Achilles executed flowed into the next and flawlessly set up his next strike. By the time you were close enough to intervene, there was no need. The warrior collapsed to the ground into a pool of his own blood created from the flow of the dozens of deep cuts. Achilles turned to look at you, his face showing no emotion, and asked, "Am I a Myrmidon now, Phoenix?" Awed by the spectacle, for in truth you doubted you would have been able to dispatch the ferocious warrior with such ease. Unable to find words, you nod, and Achilles smiled. In the following years, as he grew to full manhood and came into his strength, he quickly became first among the warriors of the Myrmidons. At 16, he was an unstoppable force on any battlefield, and the enemies of your city began to worry more about facing Achilles than the prospect of facing your entire army. At 17, he took the only wound you had ever seen him take, when his father struck him across his face for refusing his order to marry Princess Diademia from the nearby island realm of Skyros. The king's word was law, and the two were immediately married and nearly as quickly estranged. The only proof of their consummation came 9 months later, their son, Neoptolemus. In her wedding party had been a boy of 10, Patroclus, who begged to join the Myrmidons. Achilles had taken him under his wing and instructed the boy as you had him, and the bond between master and student had become very strong. In that way, Patroclus, who was manning the rudder behind you and steering the Chiron, was like a grandson to you, and you loved him dearly. All the Myrmidons did, for the youth had won their respect with his relentlessness in his training. Still a boy of 15, Achilles had informed him that he was not to leave the ship in the coming battle, the most he had spoken the entire journey. This was the true root of Achilles' anger. All men knew that Achilles was married, and using his name as the suitor for the sacrifice, Agamemnon had given mortal insult to Diademia, the mother of his child, and all of Skyros. You saw yourself in him that night on the beach when he raged after the sacrifice, for you knew you would have killed any man who insulted your wife. It had taken Ajax to restrain him until his rage cooled, though you knew his anger at the insult festered just beneath the surface. Brought back from your musing by a mighty battle cry from the beach, just seconds before your ship breaches the shore, Achilles turns to you, a look in his eyes you had seen before, a resigned look, neither warm nor cold, but calculating. He was entering what the men of the Myrmidons called his battle trance. He says, "I'll cut a path to that shrine on that hill," then pointing up a steep and heavily fortified and defended incline leading to a hilltop, where at least 50 Trojan archers were raining death down on the Greeks. "Follow quickly, Phoenix. I'll need you there." He grabs his leaning ash spear and secures his bronze shield to his arm, and seconds later, after a final assessment of his path on the battlefield, he uses the momentum of the Chiron breaching the shore to launch himself over the side and at the enemy. As soon as the Chiron jerks to a halt, you are sprinting after him, your squad of 50 dropping their oars and taking up their spears, desperate to join Achilles. You grab your spear from the rack at the prow and secure your left arm through the strap of your shield, jump over the rail, and drop, your bronze armor squealing at the impact. 14 feet later, on the sand below. Troy. Already 20 yards ahead, Achilles has decimated the first two lines of entrenched Trojan spearmen. You take a moment to assess the battlefield, knowing that your bodyguard of 50 Myrmidons who had manned the oars of the Chiron will follow and form around you in the next minute. Your ship is beached next to the ships of Salamis. You see Ajax and his younger half-brother Teucer, the archer, sniping from his shadow. The two brothers, one the biggest man alive and the other slight of build, are death itself. The combination of Ajax's size, unparalleled strength, and skill with spear and his massive tower shield, with Teucer firing expertly aimed arrows with incredible accuracy from his brother's side and rear, is devastating. The sons of Telamon are a force unto themselves. Just as well, the contingent from Salamis was mainly archers and would have taken many casualties against Trojan spearmen. Though what they lacked in infantry, they more than made up for with Ajax. The two brothers had already penetrated deep into Trojan lines and were laying waste to all who stood against them. By the time the Trojans got over their initial shock and attempted to surround the pair, the archers of Salamis had formed up and were raining clouds of arrows on the would-be attackers. The synergy of the archers and their heroes was stunning. There are far too many Greeks on the beach to assess the progress of the landing further away, a good sign perhaps. You instead adjust your helmet as you are surrounded by your bodyguard and order, "Myrmidons, arrow formation, to Achilles!" You hear your order echoed by other officers down the line. You don't need to look to know that the Myrmidon squads of 50 men from each ship further down the beach will be forming into their own triangles, with the tips pointed at their hero. Your squad begins to move ahead at a jog, cutting down any Trojans attempting to fill the trail of destruction Achilles has left on his quest to destroy the Trojan stronghold atop the hill. Even now their arrows are taking a murderous toll on the lightly armored men of Salamis. Your pace is so grueling that your men are often simply knocking down enemies and trampling them beneath their feet. The barricades that Achilles had effortlessly jumped over are proving a challenge for your formation and are greatly slowing your advance. 50 yards up the slope, Achilles is dual-wielding his spear and Chiron's sword, his shield hanging from the straps on his back. He is cutting down Trojan heroes as if they were common soldiers, and common soldiers as if they weren't there at all. You need to close the distance, but the incline and the Trojans pouring into the corpse-strewn path Achilles cut was slowing your progress even more, and Achilles was only getting further ahead. As your men decimate another group of Trojan soldiers, you see 4 Trojan chariots coming down a prepared path, followed by at least 100 men running in ranks behind them. By the quality of their armor, they could only be the palace guard, the Eagles, which meant that one of these men on the chariots would be Prince Hector, Troy's greatest hero. And worse, they were about to cut you off from Achilles. You draw in a deep breath and yell, "Myrmidons, to me!" And from dozens of yards away you hear other squads yell in answer, "To Phoenix!" And the reply comes from squads further and further away. The Myrmidons will come, but you must hold, for now, as the Eagles form their lines and the Trojan heroes dismount their chariots, Achilles was on his own. In horror you see that 3 of the heroes from the chariots are running up the slope after him, followed by 10 eagles. The wall of eagles in front of you begins to chant, "Hector! Hector! Hector!" as a tall and powerful warrior in splendid armor takes his place at the center of their line, raises his shield, and hurls his spear a dozen yards into the Myrmidon at the point of your formation. He falls, dead, the spear buried in his eye socket. He was a fine man, a friend. You grit your teeth. "Form rank," you order, and your squad halts and forms a line 49 men across. You risk the thin line because you know that the other Myrmidon squads would extend and brace the formation when they arrived. Not wishing to see Hector kill another of your men, you take the place opposite him and advance at a cautious pace, your men in lockstep beside you, shields raised, spears ready. You take a quick glance further up the slope and see Achilles locked in desperate combat with the 3 Trojan heroes who had pursued him and was about to be surrounded by the escort of 10 eagles. Yet in that instant, one eagle drops with an arrow in his back, then another, and Ajax comes barreling into the eagles like a human battering ram behind his giant figure-8 shield, the only man alive who could wield it. Eagles are thrown into the air, but these eagles can't fly. Beyond Ajax, Teucer has his bow pulled back, notched, and is taking careful aim. He looses his arrow. You know its path. You smile. You know the trap. The cousins trained and fought together since they were boys. Achilles is crouching, fending off attacks from 2 of the Trojan heroes, intentionally exposing his back to the fast-approaching third. The arrow passes over Achilles and into the Trojan's face. You thank the gods, and relief floods you for the barest hint of an instant. The brothers had seen their cousin's peril and fought through dozens of enemies to come to his aid. Together the trio were unstoppable. You lower your gaze to Hector, and tense, focus, just steps away, you ready yourself for combat. Hector strikes out with his spear. His reach is incredible. You raise your shield just in time to catch the blow. Your arm nearly buckles. Shocked at his strength, you brace yourself for his next attack. Over the next moment, you are in the hardest fight of your life. Hector is powerful, cunning, and his spear work is truly exceptional, forcing you to fight defensively. It is only your years of sparring with Achilles that allows you to survive the onslaught. You feel sweat pouring from your body, yet after what feels like an eternity, but was no more than half a minute, an officer behind Hector yells, "My prince, we must withdraw. Too many approach." Hector looks you in the eye and nods in respect. He says, "Next time, old man." The Trojans make a quick and orderly withdrawal, as 2 squads of 100 Myrmidons join your ranks. Breathing heavily, you gesture for the new arrivals to continue up the hill to Achilles, allowing your squad to rest for a moment. When you search the sandy hillside for Achilles, he is gone. You look up to the shrine and see a dozen Trojan archers fleeing the strong point. Ajax and Achilles are catching their breath, both streaked with enemy blood. Teucer raises his bow to the sky and you hear the archers of Salamis cheer, then joined by the Myrmidons with you. You capture the image of the cousins in your mind, for in that moment, the sons of Peleus and Telamon are Peerless. Thank you for listening to part 1 of Peerless. Part 2 will be available to my patrons next week, and everyone else will get it soon thereafter. Support the show. Go to patreon.com/deepintohistory. It's just 10 cents a day, and it means the world to me and the show. That's patreon.com/deepintohistory. Other amazing ways to help the show: leave a review on iTunes, and tell your friends about me. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep.